One of the best banks and credit cards here in the UAE, and is banking here in Dubai even safe? In this video, I want to give you the most detailed breakdown of banking here in the UAE as someone who's been doing it for the past 1.5 years now. I've used multiple bank accounts, tons of different credit cards. I know the ins and outs from both the personal and the business side. And I know that a lot of people who are moving here, especially from the West, might have a few reservations about banking in a totally new country and also a totally new kind of country, like a new culture. So in this video, we'll go over all of that. We'll go over what makes a bank safe in general. I actually used to be a banker and I have an economics degree. So we're going to actually look at the exact factors that experts will usually look at to determine what makes a bank safe, to see how UAE banks compare to that. And then we'll go over which banks do I use, which banks do I recommend, which ones do I not recommend, which credit cards do I use, how do you get a credit card, everything that you as someone who either lives in Dubai, who wants to move to Dubai, would need to know about banking here. This video will give you an answer to that. So first, let's discuss, is banking safe in the UAE? What if the banks fail? Are they likely to fail? And things like this, especially given that you might have seen that the UAE doesn't actually have a deposit protection scheme in the similar way that countries like the UK or the US might have. So basically, if the bank fails, the government will essentially guarantee deposit up to a certain limit. They don't technically have that here, but we'll discuss that in a moment. Before we get into that though, if you're currently someone who's considering moving to Dubai and you're looking for help with setting up your business here, and I can hook you up with my business partners down below who will give you a free 45-minute consultation where they can walk you through the entire process and explain everything that you need to know. And then after that, if you want to use their services, they can do everything for you. And by the way, on the topic of this video, the process of actually getting your first bank account can be a bit difficult. Now, for some people, I know it's been easy, but for me, it was quite the pain. So as a bonus, if you use their services, they actually have contacts at Emirates NBD, one of the banks that we're about to talk about, and they can just set you up with your bank account in just one day. So you don't have to worry about any of that process yourself. So you can get that code down below in the description. And with that, let's continue with the video. What makes a bank safe? So the first thing to understand is that no bank ever in any country is absolutely safe. Even if it's the biggest bank in the world, there's always a theoretical chance that it might fail. After all, a bank is just a business like any other business, and businesses can either do well or poorly depending on how they're run. With banks, the business model is that you deposit money into the bank and they lend that money out and they keep some portion of that in reserves. So to really understand how likely is it that you will lose your deposits in a bank, you need to look at a couple of things. The first thing that we would always look at is something called capital adequacy ratio. So basically that means how much capital, so how much reserves does a bank have relative to the obligations or the liabilities that it has, aka the loans that is given out and things like this. You can literally look at these numbers and you will be able to see that the figures for the UAE banks are very similar, even better compared to a lot of the Western banks that you might be used to using. Not that Western banks are any kind of haven of safety as we have seen in the past, especially somewhere in the US, but given that you are already willing to have your money in one of these banks, assuming you're coming from the West or whichever country you're moving from, you can look at these numbers for the banks that you already use. If you're willing to use those banks, there's no particular reason for you to think that UAE banks are less safe than your home bank. And another thing that actually makes UAE banks safer to me than Western banks, for example, is that the UAE economy is nowhere near as debt driven as, for example, the US economy. Right now, especially given how badly the economy is doing in the UK, the US, they're discussing all this crazy stuff like 0% down mortgages or like all this kind of stuff. That's just a recipe for complete disaster, as we have seen in the past. Because in the West, there is this attitude of entitlement, like, oh, I deserve to own a house, I deserve to buy this designer bag or whatever. And for that reason, because there is that demand for all of that, even from people who aren't in a financial position to afford these things, the Western societies are extremely debt driven. There's all these debt products, like these mortgages that are very easy to get, these credit cards that are just given to anyone with, because in the West, everyone's like, oh, I'm entitled to be able to buy this stuff, even though I don't have the money for it. That is why, especially the US is a very debt driven society. So there's actually a lot more risk that when things go badly, they can go very badly for the banks who actually hold that debt. The UAE is nowhere near as debt driven like that. It's a lot more conservative. For example, as a self-employed person myself, I have to put down a minimum of 40% to even get a mortgage, which for me might sound bad, but from the bank's perspective, that is a lot more safe. If you're employed, it is 20%. And in general, because in here, the cost of living, like relative to net incomes, is a lot more reasonable than in a lot of major cities in the US, for example, people don't have the resort to taking on huge debt to survive, essentially, which means that there's simply a lot less risk, like systemically, that people are not going to be able to pay off their debts and in turn for the banks to get in trouble. Now, technically, the UAE banks do not have deposit insurance, but really, if you look at this, what's the case with almost all of the major banks here is that they are either directly or indirectly owned by the government. What does that mean? Well, the government of the UAE has a massive incentive to keep up the image of the UAE as this place where basically nothing goes wrong ever. So let's say something bad was to happen to Emirates NBD, one of the major banks we're about to talk about, the government would just not allow them to go bust. Like the government would bail them out, and in turn it would mean that your deposit would be safe, because the government wouldn't want a situation, would be an absolute disaster if a situation happened where people like lost their deposits at one of the major banks here. Now again, this is obviously not a guarantee, but it's also not a guarantee that in the West you will actually get your money, even though there is this government guarantee, because a lot of these schemes are basically bankrupt anyway, but that's a whole another story for another day. But with that said, what are the best banks here? What are the banks that I actually use? So there's two kinds of banks here broadly. You have local banks and you have international banks. So local banks are basically banks that are based here in the UAE or in the Arabic world, like Emirates NBD, you've got Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. Then you've got a lot of foreign banks that simply have branches here. You've got banks like HSBC, Citi, that you might be familiar with if you're coming from the West. They actually have branches here and you can use those banks if you want. Usually what people say, and I tend to agree with this, is that the local banks tend to be better in terms of service and the kinds of offers that you get and things like this. But it might be the case that if you're coming from the West, let's say you have an HSBC account in the UK, like I used to before I moved here, it might be an easier transition and it might be easier to open that account with HSBC if you're an existing customer in a different country. Really, what you just need to look at is what do the banks offer in terms of interest rates on savings and in terms of the credit cards that you have access to. So I'm now going to describe the ones that I use, and this is just what I have found to work best for me. So the main bank I use is Emirates NBD. It's one of the more popular ones here. The service there tends to be really great. The mobile app is pretty great, and the main reason I have it is because of the credit card that I get for it, which is this one. I need to make sure I don't compromise my credit card numbers here, but this one is called the Emirates Skywards Infinite. This is, I think, the best credit card here if you're someone who travels a lot, because you get Emirates points for every purchase, and if you use these points on either business or first class, I calculated, and I really nerded out about this, by the way, that it comes out to around 3 to even up to 4% cashback. Now it really depends on which flights you're booking and things like this, what those points will end up being valued at, but it ends up being pretty good. You also get instant Emirates Silver status, which that gets you things like extra luggage on your flights. You get access to the Emirates business class lounge at the Dubai airport, even if you're not flying business class, which I'm actually about to use for the first time tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. Doesn't really have the best interest rates though on savings, so that is why I have different accounts that I'm about to talk about. But this is like my main daily driver in terms of purchases and things like this Emirates NBD with the Emirates Skywards Infinite credit card. The other one I have is Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. This was actually the first bank account that I opened, mainly because it was like the first one I was able to open. Like the process of opening these accounts can be a bit difficult, by the way. What I had to do is go to the branch and then find out I didn't have the right documents with me, so I had to go back, come back, and then they said, oh, you actually need this one more document. I had to go back again and come back. The process can be a bit of a headache. Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank was just the first one that I was able to open. I wouldn't actually recommend it that much. Actually, it has this one credit card that I thought I liked. It's called the Traveler credit card. This one, basically the main reason I got this is because number one, you get a bunch of discounts at like hotels. This is actually the best part about this card. You get 20% off all hotels.com bookings, which I've actually used a bunch on the travels that I'm about to go to around Asia and things like this. You also get 0% foreign currency transaction fees, but let me tell you the thing that they won't tell you. It's not actually 0%, because the rate that they give you on the currency conversion isn't actually the correct rate. So even though there's technically no fee, you end up paying around 1% real fee in terms of the currency conversion. So keep that in mind. And there was one welcome offer that I was supposed to get with this Traveler credit card that they never even gave to me. And when I tried to get in touch, of course, I can't even get in touch. It's just a complete mess. I'm probably going to cancel that one, to be honest, but it can work for someone. I'll leave the links to all of these down below, by the way, so you can look at the exact benefits and look at whether you will need or use these benefits. So the main bank account that I use for actually storing any of the savings I have, so I want to keep some portion of my net worth as liquid savings at a high yield savings account, and this first first Abu Dhabi bank. They have this one account called the iSave account that gets 5.25% interest rate, but I believe it's a promotional rate, but they tend to keep just extending and extending the promotion. So you can take a look if they still have that down below. But they also have this card, the cashback card. So on any groceries that you buy, you get 5% cashback. I believe you also get 5% off fuel and some other things. So anytime I buy groceries, I basically use this card. Anytime I buy anything else, essentially I use this card. And there's one more card that I use, which I'm about to tell you in a second. But first, Abu Dhabi Bank is where I mainly store my savings. The app for them is also really, really good, what I really like. There's one more really important bank that all of you should be opening if you're coming here, and that's called Wio. Wio has both the business account and the personal account. And this is the first like fully digital bank here in the UAE. So if you're coming from like the UK, for example, you might be familiar with Monzo or Revolut. It's very, very similar to that. Very good app experience. But my business banking, that's actually all I need. It's very easy to open as well. You can open it all online. You just need to upload a couple of things. They don't even have branches. So basically that is all I use for all of my business banking purposes. And they've also newly opened a personal account called Wio Personal. They also have really good interest rates because they're basically trying to attract as many new customers as possible. You can get up to 5.5% interest rates on their fixed savings spaces. The only caveat is that you have to deposit the money on the account for a minimum of 6 months to take advantage of that 5.5% interest rate. If you don't do that, you also get back 5% that is basically withdrawable at any time. They also have a credit card that has 2% cash back on everything. I use that card on certain purchases where my Emirates NBD card doesn't get points. So for example, whenever I order something on the Careem app, which is basically the taxi like Uber app of Dubai, for some reason, I don't get any points on it from the Emirates NBD card, but I do get cash back on my Wio Personal credit card. So I use that for those purchases. It probably wasn't a good use of my time to figure out like which card to use on which thing. But yeah, I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to credit card points. So there you go. That's my fully optimized credit card points maximizing scheme here in the UAE, which you're free to copy if you want. So I hope that was helpful to you. These are the accounts that I use. I've researched all of the banks and I found that these ones have most of the benefits that I want in terms of the credit card, and that gives me the best interest rates on my savings. Most of my money I'm just throwing into index funds and things like this, but of all the liquid money that I keep, these are the banks that I use. Let me know, by the way, if you are a Dubai resident and there's something that I missed that I should be using, some other credit card that gets me good points that I'm perhaps not using. I always want to learn more about that kind of stuff. But anyway, I hope this is very helpful to you. As I said, the link down below for a free consultation with my business partners. If you're currently looking to move to Dubai, we'll actually just be able to set your bank account for you in just like 1 day, so you don't have to go through any of the hassle to set this up. It's the Emirates NBD account that I talked about. With that said, if you're wondering how much does it actually cost to live in Dubai, that's a very common question I get. How much should I be making before I move here to Dubai? I actually made this video where I go over how much it actually costs to live in Dubai on a very realistic budget, depending on the area where you're living, like lots of different scenarios and things like this. So if that interests you, go watch that video next, and I'll see you in the next one.